All right, y'all. So we are going to be talking about levels of organization. So remember, biology is the study of living things, right? And one of the things that you have to know is basically about all of the living things that happen here on Earth, and then just kind of a little bit about the non-living things. But you'll see what I mean in a little bit. But these are called the levels of organization, and you'll see what you mean by that. It's basically like you see in this picture here, the individual, like you see down at the bottom, the moose, and then the population, which is a group of moose and a community. And so we'll talk about that all in a little bit of detail. But that's what we're going to start off with here is the levels of organization within an ecosystem. And I'll explain all of this yeah, in the next few slides. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So the thing that I mentioned is when we're learning about living things, you also kind of know a little. You need to know a little bit about the non-living things, right? So right here, they're kind of broken up into two groups. Whenever you see the word bio, y'all, the word bio means life, right? So whenever you see that, it's safe to say that it has to do with something that is living. So right here, you see a biotic factor in this first group. All living things that live together in an environment are biotic factors, right? So again, living things. You see here at the bottom, there's a bird and some grass, and then in the pictures right there, you see a longhorn, cattle, and then I think in the middle there it's kind of small, but that looks like fungus, like mushrooms and things like that. And then above that, you see what looks like grass or maybe moss. But again, those are all living things, right? Those are biotic factors. And then in this next piece right here, the second half of the screen, you see it says abiotic factors, right? So abiotic means all non-living factors, such as water, soil, light, and temperature. So again, those are not living. So abiotic means non-living, and then biotic just means living, right? But they got to live together. They've evolved. They've worked together, right? Living things and non-living things have lived on this earth for what is it, hundreds of millions of years, right? And so yeah, this is a big difference between biotic and abiotic factors. And so list the biotic parts and the abiotic parts in the picture below. All right, so let's talk about the six levels of environmental organization. Right, so basically, this is just saying that this is how the biosphere, which is all living things on the planet, are organized. Right, so at the smallest point, the smallest level right here, you have this crocodile, right? So these crocodiles right here, an organism is just one thing, right? So there's just one crocodile right there. And so that's an organism, right? You are an organism. You're just one living thing. A single little piece of bacteria is a living thing. A flower is an organism. A plant, any kind of plant, and anything that is alive and is by itself is an organism, right? So this right here, the crocodile is the smallest level. There's only one crocodile here, and that's an organism. Above that, you have the population, right? So the population, you see that there is more than one crocodile right here, right? There are a few of them. And so that's what a population is a group of the same species. And when I say the word species, and let me just kind of write it out right here. Whenever you see the word species, that means that they are of the same type of animal or living thing, and that they can have a baby together, and they can mate and have a baby, and then that baby can have a baby, right? And sometimes two animals can mate and have a baby, but then that baby cannot have a baby, like a horse and a donkey. If they get together and they make a baby, that's a mule, but a mule cannot have a baby. A mule is sterile, so it cannot have babies, right? So species, again, these crocodiles are all the same species. And let me put it right here so you can see what I'm talking about. These guys right here, they're all the same species, right? And so that's what a population is. They're all the same species living in one area. When you're talking about like the population of Austin, you're talking about all of the humans living in one area, right? If you're talking about the ants that live in your yard, those are the ants that live in your yard. That is a population of ants, right? So that's what a species is. A community right here is different species of living things living together, right, in the same area. And so right here you see you have some birds, and then you have like it looks like a crab. Where is it? The crab right here. Looks like you have some birds right here, and then over here you have some crocodiles, and then over here you have, and then get a different color. You have some grass right here, some trees. So all of these are living things, right, and living in one different species living together, right. And so these right here are all examples of a community. All right, but let's look right here. This is an ecosystem. So the ecosystem right here, an ecosystem is a bunch of living things together, a bunch of communities of living things together, but then it's also got abiotic factors. Remember when we talked about that word right there? abiotic. Abiotic, remember, means non-living things, right? So here, water is not alive. So water would be part of that abiotic. If you have dirt, if you have rocks, the environment, all of the things that are not living, those are the abiotic factors. So remember, ecosystem is the abiotic and biotic factors living together in an area. And we'll see it more right now in more detail. And then a biome, y'all, is just, you can see right here, a biome is just a larger piece of area. And some biomes include like deserts and rainforests and tundra and things like that. Right. And then up here, you see the biosphere and you see the picture over here of the Earth. Right. So, Earth, y'all, whenever you see the word right here, bio, remember, bio means living. Right. And then when you see the word sphere, sphere just means like a ball, right? It's shaped like a ball. So, biosphere is just basically all the living things on Earth. Right, so let's see that just in a little bit more detail, y'all. And I will repeat myself quite a bit, but that's intentional, right? That's the point of learning is you got to repeat something over and over and over until you start to understand it, right? And then when you know the concepts, then you can connect big pictures together. But here, the organism, just an individual animal, plant, or single cell life form, right? Like I said, any living thing that is on its own. The population, a group of organisms of the same species that live together. So earlier we saw the crocodiles, right? But here you see zebras. This is a population of zebras living in this area, right? So in the same, and again, species means that they can have babies with each other, and then those babies can have babies, right? And so there are some things like a zonkey. I don't know if y'all have ever heard of a zonkey before, but a zonkey is a mix between a zebra and a donkey, and a zebra and a donkey can have a baby, but then that baby cannot have any babies, right? It is sterile. And so, that's what, again, a species means. So, what is a population? In biology, a population, again, just a group of organisms of the same species. So, here the example that you see are wolves, right? How large a population is and how fast it is growing are often used as a measure of its health. So, those population numbers are growing quickly and they're growing and then they're growing quickly, then that is a good sign of that population. Sometimes that can be a bad thing for the other populations, right? Like if like deer in an area, wolves are good because they control the deer population. But if all of a sudden you get rid of wolves and the deer number, you get more and more deer, and they just start eating all the plants and all the food basically that other populations can eat, then those other populations are going to get hurt. Right. So even if it's good for one population, that doesn't mean it's good for all the other populations. So here's some population examples. All right, all of the gray wolves that live in Yellowstone National Park. Again, we're just talking about wolves, groups of wolves, but in one area, right? The national park. All of the grackles that live in Austin. So grackles are a type of bird, right? And these birds we're just counting the ones that live in Austin. That is an example of population. All of the fire ants that live in Mr. Stanley's yard. So all of those fire ants, they are all one type of organism and they all live in one area, right? Mr. Stanley's yard. So that is an example of a population. And again, like I said, cities, when you go into a city, you will see that when it has a population on the sign, like going into a city, it's talking about the humans in that area, right? So that again is population. All right, so now you go ahead and try it. All of the blank that live in blank, right? Would be an example of a population. So there are limits to population growth, right? Some things will grow really quickly, but eventually there's got to be some limits, right? The limiting factor is a property of an environment which affects process of population growth. All that means, y'all, is like, for example, food, right? If you have something, it's like I was saying with the deer, right? If you have deer and all of a sudden their population number starts growing and growing and growing, and there's no wolves around to eat the deer, and then the deer just keep growing and growing and growing, and you go from like 100 deer to 200 deer to 300 deer, and the number just keeps growing. Well, the limiting factor is probably going to be all of the plants that they eat, right? Once they finish the food, then the deer are not going to have any more food, and then the deer are going to start to die, right? So that limiting factor right there is the food, like the grass and the plants that they eat. And so that would be the limiting factor. Sometimes it's water, right? Sometimes there's not enough water for the population to keep growing. And it's interesting because, like in China, when you see with humans, one of the limiting factors for their population growth is that there's not enough females, right, to mate with the males. So then there's no more babies that they're having. There's other things, right? But these are some of those limiting factors. And so a carrying capacity, that's just the max population that can live in an area, right? So after that, after you hit the carrying capacity and you go over the carrying capacity, all of a sudden there's no more food, there's no more water, things like that, and then the population will come down, right? The organisms will die in that population and it'll go down. The two major types of limiting factors here: density dependent factors and density independent factors. And so for this one, it's just the depending on how dense those whoops and And so the limiting factor limits to population growth, right? We have these limiting factors. Again, it can be something like food, right? If all of the deer in one area, they grow so large that all of the food is eaten, then that limiting factor is the food, right? If there's so many animals in one area that they drink all the water and there's no more water for the animals, then that limiting factor was the water. Right. Sometimes in humans, like what happens in China, is that there's so many males there, not enough females there, that eventually the limiting factor will probably be females, because there's not going to be enough females for males and females to mate and have babies, right? So carrying capacity is it kind of goes with that, right? The carrying capacity is just the max population that can live in an area. So it means, like, let's say the number is 200. 200 is a carrying capacity. That means if you have more than 200 organisms in that population, then if you go past that, then all of a sudden there's not going to be enough food or water or whatever it is, and then that population is going to go down. So the numbers are going to go from 200 to 100 to 50 to zero, right? If everyone dies. And so there are two major types of limiting factors: density dependent factors and density independent factors. So let's look at those right now. So density dependent factors, right? They depend on the density of a population. So the more dense, the stronger the effect is of that density dependence, right? So disease, food availability, water, mating opportunities, shelter, all of these right here, you see that the more dense something is, the stronger the effect of that is going to be. And then predation, just meaning predators, right? Things that eat all of the other organisms, like wolves, right, are predators to deer. And so density independent factors. So again, y'all think about this, right? The more something is, the more people, the more living things you have in an area, the more it's going to be affected by this, right? So food availability. If you have a lot of people, there's going to be less food. If you have a lot of people, there's going to be more disease. If you have a lot of people, there's going to be less water. Like I said, with China, they were, they would value males being born and not females. And so now they have too many males and not enough females. And now there's news articles about China's population collapsing, right? We'll see if that happens. I don't know if that's going to happen, but that's what they say in the news, right? Then shelter, if there's so many people, then they took all the shelter, there's no more shelter. And then the same thing, right? If there's too many predators, they're going to eat all the prey. And then the populations are going to be, one is going to be real big and one of them is going to be really small. So again, it just means the more dense the population is, the more living things there, the more these are affected, the more those living things are affected by these things. Right? Then you have density independent factors. So independent of density of population, it doesn't matter how big the population is. These things are going to happen. And I don't know, now with humans, though, it's kind of different because we've kind of messed up the whole earth. So we've kind of affected a lot of these things. But usually it doesn't matter how big a population is. Like if you have a lot of deer in the forest, that's not really going to prevent a forest fire. It's not going to cause a forest fire. So again, the forest fire is independent of how many deer you have. Same thing with hurricanes, right? Hurricanes, it doesn't matter how many people you have living in these areas, you're still going to get a hurricane, right? It is independent of how many living things you have in those areas. Again, with climate change, we've probably messed this up, but the next one, you see the drought right there, right? All of the dry ground. That drought it doesn't depend on how many people or living things you have in an area. Not usually, right? If they go and they drink all the water, then yes, but usually it's just because there's no rain in those areas. And then pollution right here. Well, this one we did cause this, right? We do cause this right here. And so the winter you see right there, the ice on the plant, it doesn't usually depend on the population, whether winter or how cold it gets or things like that, right? So again, if it's independent, it does not matter the size of the population. Right, then let's move on to community. A community is a group of different organisms living in the same place. Right, so you can see right here, there's elephant and zebra, and it looks like gazelles, maybe I think is what those are called. And then there might be like some frogs in the water, things like that. And so groups are different organisms living in the same place. You also see trees and bushes and things like that. So again, groups of organisms living in the same place. You can also think of Austin as a community, right? We have humans and cats and dogs and bugs and all kinds of different things, trees, grass, all living in one area. Communities are made up of populations of different species. The biotic part of an ecosystem, remember, y'all, biotic just means living thing, right? That is, these are talking about the living parts of an ecosystem and all the populations, of the species in the same area. Right. So here you see there's like a bird, there's a couple birds, there's a raccoon, a wolf. Not a very good picture, but you can kind of see those things here. And also includes their interactions, right? How the wolves and the raccoons and the plants and all of that, they interact together. And so here is this example right here. This table shows some observations made by 4 students during a field trip to a nature area. Then it says at the bottom, which student made observations of a community of organisms? Right. So for this one, you would have to find, again, what it is that has living things living in the same area, but not just one kind of living thing, right? Different species of organisms. All right. All right. Now let's talk about ecosystem in a little more detail. So, an ecosystem is made up of a community of organisms and the abiotic environment of the community. So, remember, y'all, what we saw just a little while ago is a community, right? These are all the living things in one area, different species living in one area, right? So, all the living things, all the biotic parts. When you get here to the ecosystem, you'll see that now they added the word right here and they underlined it. I'll just kind of highlight it for you all right here. But they also put the word abiotic, right? So in an ecosystem, it is made up of a community of organisms. So you have the living things right here, and I'll kind of put that in green, right? Organisms are the living things, and then the abiotic is the non-living, right? So it's all together, community, the biotic and abiotic living together. An ecologist studying the ecosystem could examine how organisms interact, as well as how temperature, precipitation, and soil affects the organisms, right? So right here, what he's talking about, or what they're talking about right here, the temperature is abiotic, precipitation is abiotic, and soil is abiotic, right? So those are all the non-living things, and then here they're living with the organisms, so living and non-living things, right? And here you see an example of an ecosystem. You see this dead log right here on the ground. That is abiotic. The water is abiotic, but inside the water and even on the logs, you have living things, right? Those turtles, a fish, um, looks like you have little plants living in the water. And then up here, you have the deer and you have this eagle. And so all of these things are the ecosystem, right? Biotic and abiotic together. All right. And so ecosystems can vary in size. A lake could be considered an ecosystem. So could a dead log on a forest floor. Both contain a variety of species that interact with each other and with abiotic factors, right? So I don't know if you've ever been to a lake, but you got all kinds of things in the lake, right? There's stuff living inside the water, maybe even on the water, and there's stuff on the beaches and in the woods right there by the water. All of those things are considered in ecosystems. You have living and non-living things. Same thing with this dead log right here. I don't know if y'all have ever had like a rock or a log or something, and then you flip it over like in your yard, and then all of a sudden there's all these insects and all kinds of little things underneath there, and even the log itself, right? That's all an ecosystem. So ecosystems, like it says, it can be large or it can be small. But remember, it's living and non-living things interacting together, like in a certain area. And so this question right here, the diagram shows some of the levels of biological organization. So here you see, the first picture is showing you one thing right here, and then this one is showing you something else. And then this one is showing you, so it's kind of pointing out a few different things here. And I guess let me erase this because it should have highlighted it like that, right? You see this, a group of organisms. And then here you see it's not just the buffalo anymore, right? You do have the buffalo, but now you have a bunch of little random things right here. These look like gophers, maybe. This looks like a snake right here. Um, and then up here you have an eagle, it looks like flying. And so, you're seeing three different types of levels of organization. So in what order do you see them here in these pictures or in this diagram? All right, so ecosystem components. You have habitats. Y'all, a habitat is just a place where something lives, right? And so even here in Austin, we have a place called Habitats for Humanity. What their job is to do is basically build houses for people that don't have enough resources to build them themselves, right? So habitat is just kind of a place to live. Whenever you see that next word right there, this one right here, some people pronounce it niche, some people niche. It all depends on how you like to pronounce it. But this basically means it's a little place. You fit like a little place in the environment, right? So for me, like I was talking about being a teacher here at the Excel Center. My niche is science, right? And so for me, that's a little space that I take up in this ecosystem of the Excel Center, right? If you're talking about like birds, you see right here in this picture, this bird right here on the right, they look like woodpeckers, and their niche is just living like on that part of the tree right there. They don't live on the ground part of the tree, and they don't live like on the highest, very top part of the tree. They live somewhere in the middle. Right. So that is their niche right there. And niche isn't just like where they are located. It's also what time of the day do they eat, right? What time of the day do they mate? Because some birds' niche is like eating during the day, and some of them are nocturnal, which means that they are active at night, right? So that's also part of the niche right here, and that kind of works for me too because I'm a day teacher, right? We also have night teachers here, and so that would be their niche, right? There's a nighttime science teacher, that's their niche. Mine is actually science, but also pretty much anything else they ask me to teach, right? That's my niche. Competitive exclusion principle. Oh, and the picture right there to the left, it looks like there's a big clam and then a bunch of little clams, they're like a little shellfish that are stuck on that, right? And that's where they live. That's their niche. That's their place in the ecosystem. And so competitive exclusion principle, y'all, it's very interesting. It's a very interesting principle. It's just saying that if there's two animals or two organisms, or you can even say two species, right? And they're trying to live in the same niche, it's not going to work out well for one of them, especially if one of them just gets one little bit of an advantage, like the species has like a better way to eat food at the daytime, and the other one isn't that good at eating food during the daytime. Maybe their vision, their eyesight is not very good, and so the one that has better eyesight and can eat better during the day, then that one is going to have a big advantage over the one that cannot. And then eventually the one that can eat better during the day is going to have a bigger, healthier population, and the one that cannot is not going to have a very big population. Because like it says right here, competitive exclusion, it means they're competing for food, or they're competing for habitats, or they're competing for mates, right? And if one of them has an advantage over the other, then the other one is their population is going to go down, and the one that has the advantage is going to go up, right? So that's what the competitive exclusion principle means right here, right? Is that if they're competing and one of them has an advantage, the one with the advantage is going to do a lot better than the one that does not have that advantage. All right, and so here the habitat, just a physical environment to which an organism has become adapted and survives in. Right, so here you see these are different organisms, different animals in their habitat, and we're using a lot of animals, but remember plants are also living things, little microscopic cells and bacteria and things like that. Those are also living things, right? And they all have habitats. You probably never even really thought of this, but your stomach is a habitat. Your body is a habitat. We have so much bacteria living in our bodies that we are their habitat, right? This is where they live, in our stomach, on our skin. Like, we have bacteria everywhere on our bodies. And so, we see a lot of animals, but remember, habitats, all living things, not just animals, plants, cells, all of that, right? And so, something interesting about habitats that I was reading is our homes of animals, that usually when an animal is closer to its home, it is more aggressive. And so, like if two animals are going to fight each other, it's been said that the one that is closest to its home or its habitat is going to be the more aggressive one. And that kind of makes sense, right? If you think of us like humans, if someone comes into your house like uninvited, you are going to be very aggressive, right? Especially if you have your children and things, your valuables there at your home. And so it's kind of like that with animals too. So I just wanted to throw that in there because I always found that interesting on like aggression. The closer they are to their house, the more aggressive they're going to be. But it's just a physical environment to which an organism has become adapted and survives in. So if you look at that who's that, Finding Nemo, right? That orange clownfish, those blue things right there, I think those are called sea anemone. Anemone. anemone, anemone, one of those. And they sting other animals that come through there. But this fish has become adapted so that they don't sting him when he's in that water, or she, in those blue sea anemone things. Anemone. Yeah. And so, they've adapted to that environment. Same thing with those polar bears. They can withstand the cold. We'd probably die if we had to go up and live in that area, but polar bears are good. And the same thing with that monkey. I think it's a macaque. And yeah, it's adapted to live there in the jungles. And so the niche, this is what we're talking about, right? It's an organism's occupation or the role where it lives and the way in which organisms use conditions they exist in. So that's what I was saying, right? Like my niche is teaching science here. But for these animals right here, right, there's different adaptations that they have. That one that has like a really long pointy beak, the very top one right here, this guy is a what do you call it? Nectarivore, right? And nectarivore, if you see that right there, that its beak, it's used to suck nectar out of the flowers, right? So that's why it's adapted that niche right there. It has evolved that beak so that it can just kind of drink the nectar of the flowers, and it doesn't have to compete with this guy right here, the insectivore, for insects, right? So this one's drinking the nectar, this one's eating insects, and so they don't compete, right? And this guy right here is eating grain. That's its niche. This guy right here eats seeds. This one's for fishing, netting. So it catches fish differently. It just opens its mouth and they swim in there. Filter feeding. This looks like a flamingo, and it kind of sticks its head under the water, kind of like where the muck is, the mud, and it filters all that and eats like the shrimp. That's the interesting thing about flamingos, y'all, is they say they're normally like a white color, but because they eat shrimp, which is pink, eventually the flamingos turn pink. And so this guy, look at its beak right here, surface probing. It means it just checks the water, the surface of the water, right, for maybe little tadpoles and insects. And so, different things, right? So this one is mostly focusing on the food that they eat. That's why their beaks are shaped in this way. In Bio B, you'll learn about Charles Darwin, and his finches, and how their beaks were shaped because of where they lived and what they ate. They're placed in the food web, right? So are they food for something, or are they eating other living things, right? What is their place in that food web? How it gets its food, and we just kind of went over all of these different kind of birds over here. Some get the nectar, some insects, some fish, shrimp, all of those different kinds of not just the food it eats, but how it gets them, right? And a lot of these you see, the shape of their beak is what allows them to eat the food the way they do. And so the range of the temperature, some of these guys will live in very cold areas. Some of them would die if they got in super cold areas, right? A lot of birds will migrate though. They'll go up south during the winter, and then, sorry, they'll go, yeah, south during the winter, and then in the summers, they'll go back up north, right? So birds will change, but for the most part, birds will have a niche or a niche in certain temperatures. And then also when and how it reproduces. So that's one thing, right? Some of these may reproduce during the day, some of them at night. And so, it all depends. Maybe some of them during the winter, some of them during the summer. So it all depends on what their niche is, right? What their role is in the environment. And so a biome is just a group of similar ecosystems with the same general abiotic factors and primary producers. Biomes may be terrestrial or aquatic. So again, this is like the desert. This is like rainforest. This right here, I keep saying tundra. I don't know if y'all know what a tundra is, but basically it's a really cold area where the plants barely grow because of how cold it is, but there's still plants there and things like that. And then an aquatic biome, again, just means something underwater, right? So yeah, biomes are huge or bigger chunks of land that has those ecosystems with the same general abiotic factors, like deserts, right? They have cactus, well, abiotic, well, the cactus would be biotic, but abiotic would be like the temperature, how much rain it gets, like what kind of ground is there, is it soil, is it sand, so those kinds of things. So here's a survey of some terrestrial biomes. So here you see like the tropical rainforest. You'll see them like down here in South America in this area. Right here where we live, it's usually like a subtropical area. Where I used to live in the Rio Grande Valley down here, you see like Florida and the eastern part of the United States is kind of this temperate deciduous forest. And so it all depends on that. That's one of the cool things about the US is you have all these different biomes just within the US. And then you can see when you get up north, you get into the polar ice caps, and the tundra is like kind of in between. And so, yeah, these are what the biomes are right here. And the tropical deserts, you'll see there's some like in California and Nevada in that area, and then in like the continent of Africa, and even in Australia down here, you see a lot of deserts, right? So that's what a biome is. They're classified by climatic factors, which is like basically how cold and how wet and how dry and hot areas are. And types of primary producers, y'all, we'll learn about that in a little bit, but primary producers are like the first thing that I don't know if you want to think about like plants, right? They kind of make food just through sunlight. And so the biosphere is just a part of the earth where life exists, right? Again, bio, you can see right here, and it kind of doesn't stand out too well against this, but you can see right here, biosphere. Bio means living, and then sphere just means like a ball shaped, right? So all the living things on Earth extends from the deepest parts of the ocean, and it gets very deep in the ocean, y'all, like super deep. Extends, and then it goes up into the highest, into the air, right, where plant spores drift. So plant spores, y'all, are just kind of little, super small seeds that will float through the air, right? That's kind of how you can think of spores. And mushrooms and fungus also release spores. Ecologists study the biosphere to see how organisms interact with the abiotic environment, right? So, how living things interact with the non living things. And so, you could think of that as how fish adapt in the water, right? There was this huge shortage of like, what was it, lobsters or something like that. And they had to shut down the lobster industry because there were no lobsters. And then people were like freaking out. Well, what happened to the lobsters? Where did all the lobsters go? We used to catch tons of them, and now we can't find any lobsters. And it turns out that the temperature of the water is getting too high, and lobsters love cold water. So when the temperatures get too high, they start to die inside of that water. And then there's no more lobsters for anyone to fish because they're all dead, right? So that's kind of what ecologists are studying is like, how did those lobsters, which are biotic, how were they affected by the abiotic factor of the warming up of the ocean water, right? The Earth's atmosphere, water, soil, and rock are all part of that environment. And so, yeah, again, biosphere is just all the living things on the planet. And so here's another example of a question. A science class is planning a field trip to a local farm that has a large pond. Which of the following lists of the order of a biological organization from smallest to largest that the students can expect to find at the pond? Remember, you also for this one, you kind of, if you don't know for a fact, just start with like the process of elimination, right? Hopefully you know by now that, the first thing should be on here. That should be on here, should be organism. So you see these two have organism. This one does not. But that's just part of it. So whenever you do these, start with the process of elimination. And then if you kind of remember which is the largest one. So for the largest one, it was biosphere, but I don't see biosphere. But the next thing was ecosystem. So let me highlight these. And I know it's not this one right here. So I'm just going to kind of scratch this out. And so population, I know it's also not this one because an organism is a first and it comes before population. All right. And so just by doing that, you kind of reduce your chances from what is it? So you have all of those right there, right? And so now you have a 50-50 chance of getting the right answer, right? So make sure that when you're taking exams and things like that, that you always use a process of elimination to scratch out the ones that you know are not the right answer, right? And so then, yeah, go ahead and figure the rest out on your own. And so here you just kind of see that recap, right? Remember that the individual is just the individual one, right? Like one living thing. And then a population is a group of those living things in one area, right? And here you see this is a moose and this is a group of mooses. And then here you have the community, right? Different living things living together. And here you see a moose. It looks like a cougar, or a beaver, a rabbit, an owl. And then over here in the ecosystem, you have different things living together. You have bears and I don't even know, maybe another bear there. But it's also with the abiotic things, right? Like mountains and water and dirt and things like that. And then the biome, you see here, the biome are, like things like a tundra, a desert, a rainforest, those kinds of things. And then the biosphere, again, is just all the living things on the planet Earth.